Welcome to the Kennedy Report. I'm Kennedy Hall. I'm here with a friend who's not my brother. We just happen to both be Canadian and wearing flannel and having beards, but that's just, you're actually required to look that way or they kick you out of the country. So when Joe comes to visit, he's actually going to have a flannel shirt and a beard. Otherwise, they won't let him in. It's a fact. And super special show tonight, ladies and gentlemen. We've got our friend Rob Marro here, who has an incredible story about a friendship with none other than the notorious, infamous, mysterious, whatever adjective you want to use, Malachi Martin. We had a huge reception to our Martin episode, and Rob just fell into my lap through a mutual friend. And we've been talking, getting to know each other. He's a great guy. He's got a great story. And we're going to share some information about Malachi Martin that I don't know if I've heard anywhere else. And there is a chance that Malachi Martin was actually a cardinal of the Catholic Church. And this is something we're going to talk about on this show. But first, ladies and gentlemen, before we get going, we're going to just say thank you to our friends over at Pray Latin. So Pray Latin is an apostolate in business, essentially, where they are giving people the opportunity to learn how to say prayers in Latin, pray the traditional prayers of the Catholic Church. So you can see here on the screen, I have the St. Michael prayer, and I love these cards that they make, where you got to buy the card to see the whole video. Obviously, there's a little bit of marketing involved there. But they show you where they actually have the Latin word, and under it, they have the phonetic spelling. And as someone who taught languages for about a decade, I can tell you that these are extremely helpful and useful. I wish I had stuff like this when I was teaching French and Spanish to my students. This is much more useful than the universal phonetic symbols that no one knows anymore unless they're like a linguistics nerd like I was. Students are not learning these things. So because we're talking about Malachi Martin, who was definitely an enemy of the devil, I can imagine that the old scratch, as Martin called him, probably doesn't like us doing this stream. So we're actually going to start with the St. Michael prayer in Latin. So in nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Sancte Michael Arcangele, defende nos in proelio, contra nequitem et insidias diabolo est presidium. Impiriti Deus supplicis te precamur tuque princips militiae celestis, Satana maliosque spiritus malignos, quid perditionem animarum pervagantur in mundo divine virtutem infernum detrude. Amen. Nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, that's enough of me. First, how's everybody doing tonight?
Doing well.
Yeah. Joe, how are you, buddy?
Doing well over here, Kennedy.
Are you here to help? Are you living the dream?
Always here to help.
All right.
24/7, 365.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Stand by and get some, as Jocko would say.
Stand by to get some.
All right. So, Rob, why don't you give us a quick background and tell us how you came to be a friend of Malachi Martin?
Okay, very good. My most recent job since 1999, I was an anti-money laundering, financial crimes prevention compliance officer in New York on Wall Street. Prior to that, almost 15 years, I was an operations officer with the Central Intelligence Agency.
CIA.
Yes. And it was during my tenure with the CIA that I became friends with his formal title, Reverend Dr. Malachi Martin, that I became friends with Father Malachi. And it's actually, there's no mystery about it. We had been talking about it earlier today. What brought about the meeting was, if you remember back in the early, I think it was 1991, the Irish singer Sinead O'Connor appeared on the American TV show Saturday Night Live, and she held up a picture of Pope John Paul II, and she said, "We have to fight the real enemy," and she ripped his picture up into little pieces on stage. And the next day, a priest at Old St. Agnes's Church, before the wooden church burned down, Father John Perricone, he gave a rousing sermon about how, had that been done to a picture of a prominent Jewish or Muslim leader, that there would literally be crowds of people outside of 30 Rockefeller Plaza stoning the building. He said, but Catholics have been so conditioned by a mistaken understanding of turning the other cheek that they're willing to almost accept anything thrown their way. So I just went backstage. I went back to the sacristy after Mass to congratulate Father on the excellence of his sermon. And we ended up meeting for some cheap Chinese food on the Upper West Side of Manhattan later that week. And in the course of the conversation, I had told him that I was reading a book entitled The Keys of This Blood by Malachi Martin. And he told me, he said, I know Malachi. Would you like to have dinner with him some night? And I did my best not to leap out of my seat. And I said, of course. Who wouldn't? And it was that that meeting at a restaurant on the Upper East Side of New York City, where we got there at about 6 p.m., ended up closing the restaurant around 11:30, only because the head waiter came over to us kind of semi-apologetically and said, we don't mean to rush you home, but the wait staff wants to go home for the evening. So that's what that's how I met Father Malachi.
So, like a good Irishman, he was able to stay in the tavern until the wee hours of the morning, if need be.
Oh yes, without a doubt.
And when you guys met, were you a practicing Catholic?
Yes, I was. I was I guess what you would call today, a conservative Novus Ordo Catholic who had just discovered the traditional Roman Mass, I guess what they call the Tridentine Mass. It was right after 1988 when I think it was the second motu proprio from John Paul II came out regarding it. And it was one of very few locations in New York City where it was offered as a high mass on Sundays. And that was Fulton Sheen's old church. In fact, East 43rd Street in New York City, next to Grand Central Station, is known as Fulton Sheen Plaza.
Joe's from New York. Joe, are you familiar with that location?
Oh, sure. I'm familiar with the names. I'm familiar with the places. I'm familiar. Father Perricone is still at large out there saying the traditional Mass on Sunday, and I think in Queens.
Yes.
Queens, New York now. Yeah, so he's
for a while. Do you know Father Perricone?
I don't know him personally. He is a friend of mine, spiritual director though. So he's sort of.
Your friend's in very good hands.
Yes, yeah. So Father Perricone's been in my sort of my peripheral vision, but not. I've not crossed paths with him yet. I'm a Long Islander, and in and out of the city very often. Malachi Martin, I wrote an article, and I'm not doing trying to plug my own stuff here, but I wrote an article for 1 Peter 5 on.
Joe, hold on. How dare you plug your stuff? Everyone, please click the link in the description to like the video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the Kennedy Report if you'd like, and buy my books. But Joe, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, so I wrote an article for 1 Peter 5 on New York Catholicism, right? And I would like to write a follow-up on it because it mostly was about Dietrich von Hildebrand, but Malachi Martin is, to me, while not being native to New York, is just in many ways the embodiment of New York Catholicism by being this enigmatic Irish intellectual that. And New York City is something of a refugee for intellectuals, which is what von Hildebrand was. And I think we saw the same with Martin, who at one point was even driving a city taxi cab. So
Yep.
the narrative of his life is just so apropos, living here my whole life.
So, Rob, you are going to tell us this idea that Malachi Martin was a cardinal, but before you become a cardinal, normally speaking, you have to become a bishop. So why don't you tell us that story about how Malachi actually became a bishop?
Sure. It was in late 1950s, in the waning days of the pontificate of, is he Venerable Pius XII yet?
Yes, he's venerable. Yeah.
Okay. All of you guys keep going in and out, so I don't know what's going on.
I'm just putting you on, when you're telling your stories, it's solo layout so they can just listen to your story better.
Okay, very good. Thank you. It was in the waning days of the pontificate of Pius XII, and what had happened was, of course, it was just after the reign of Stalinism in Eastern Europe, and the iron boot of the Marxist-Leninist party state was still heavily upon the countries of Eastern Europe. Well, what happened was in Czechoslovakia, in the underground church of the time, in the underground Catholic church, one of the priests had kind of gone off the rails, and he had fathered several children with an unmarried woman. And I know a lot of people these days would at least roll their eyes and say, well, at least he was with a woman. But back at the time, it was quite scandalous, as it should be. And when the underground bishop went to this priest, the priest said, if you say anything about me to Rome, I will denounce you to the Czech STB, which was the Czechoslovakian secret police controlled by the Soviet KGB. Well, the bishop sent word via the underground messaging system to the Vatican that he had a very serious problem on his hands, because not only was he at risk, but the other underground priests in the church were at risk as well. Not just in Prague, but cities like Bratislava, etc. And Malachi at this point was a Jesuit priest, albeit a young one. But he had kind of earned his stripes in terms of being, he'd earned his stripes in terms of his trustworthiness with, being an aide to Cardinal Bea, the very high-ranking Jesuit cardinal.
Can you give us a little, before we continue,
Sure.
A lot of these people are, it's sort of inside baseball in the Vatican. Was Cardinal Bea a good guy, a bad guy? How would we describe him in your opinion?
We would describe him today, he would be described as a good guy. And I'll tell you why. Because although he was somewhat liberal, he was liberal in the classic sense of liberal. The same way as if someone were to say 25 years ago, I'm going to college to get a liberal arts education. It does not mean today's liberal, off the deep end, wacky political viewpoint, as well as social perspectives. He was a classic liberal. So, in that respect, he was a good guy. He wasn't what you would think of like currently as like a Cardinal Supich of Chicago or someone of that ilk.
Well, to add to that, someone like John Paul II would be a liberal in a lot of ways, but at the same time was still very socially conservative, was still very orthodox in certain ways. Not that liberalism is good, but you hear about Paul VI being a liberal, and yeah, he definitely was in some ways. But you look at some of the things Paul VI said and the credo of the people of God and stuff, and it's like, He looks like Leo the 13th compared to Pope Francis some of the time. So it's a good distinction to make.
Yes, so he was an aide to Cardinal Bea, and obviously the word had gotten to Cardinal Bea regarding what was going on in Czechoslovakia. And I guess the powers that be in the Vatican ruminated over what the solution to this was, and they decided they had to send a bishop, because a priest can't laicize another priest. It has to be a bishop who laicizes a priest. And they decided the man for the job, or the priest for the job, was Father Malachi Martin. And when they described the problem to him in the Vatican, Malachi said, "But I'm not a bishop." And whoever the Cardinal Secretary of State was at the time said, "We can take care of that in that little chapel over there in about 20 minutes." And he was made a bishop of the Catholic Church, albeit in pectore, meaning in secret, held close to the chest. And he went to Czechoslovakia. He met with the underground bishop, and the bishop fully filled him in on what was going on. Then the next day, and he traveled there by train. The next day, he met with this priest, and this priest said, "I don't know who you are." And he said, "I'm a bishop from the Vatican. That's all you need to know. And, you now have a chance to renounce this life of sin that you have adopted and, recant what you have done and seek Christ's forgiveness." And the priest said no. And Malachi said, are you sure? Because there will be consequences for you as a priest. And the priest said, "I'm very sure. I'm not changing." And Malachi said, then, as a successor of the apostles, I am declaring that you will be laicized, and all of your priestly faculties will be withdrawn officially. You will no longer be a priest able to celebrate the sacrifice, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, or hear confessions. And no sooner was Malachi out this priest's door than the priest was on the phone to the Czech secret police, and he said, "There's going to be a man showing up at the train station. He's going to look like this. He's going to be dressed like this. I suggest you arrest him because he's a spy from the Vatican." And Malachi was arrested by the Czech secret police, and he was subsequently held for an indeterminate period of time, where he was questioned, and it was only when the Vatican threatened to make a very large international stink out of one of their priests being held by the Czech secret police that Malachi was released and put on a railroad train to Austria. So
that was in about 55, 56, somewhere around there?
No, that would have been a little bit later, probably around 1957.
Okay, because Paul or Pius XII was done in 58, so just before he ended his reign.
Correct. It was just prior to his going to his eternal reward.
Okay, and then after that, Malachi, he decides to, what would the term be? He wants to be secularized. He's not laicized, he's not penalized, but he just sort of wants to go live a scholarly life or something.
Right. Well, what he did was he approached Pope Paul VI, because he was at the time a Vatican functionary, and he requested what is called in the Vatican a rescript, because he asked to be released from 2 of his 3 vows: his vow of obedience, so he could be released from the Jesuit order, and from his vow of poverty, so he could earn a living in the West, because he would have to do something to earn money, to earn his keep. He did not request to be released from his vow of celibacy. And in fact, there's I call it the big lie as it concerns Father Malachi, and that is that he was laicized and reduced to the lay state from being a member of the clergy. That's not true. And the late William Kennedy actually contacted the United States Jesuit Conference in Washington, D.C. in 2003, 2004. And he spoke with the spokesman and got a letter from him, Father Tom Whitmer, who went to Father, I believe, Vincent O'Keefe, who at the time in the mid-1960s was the head of the Jesuit provincials in North America. And he confirmed, Father O'Keefe confirmed, that Malachi Martin was a priest in good standing his entire life up until his death, that he had not been reduced to the state of a layman. Now, given the amount of garbage that the Jesuits threw at Malachi Martin for his 1976 book, The Jesuits, why Father O'Keefe decided to kind of come clean at that moment, because he didn't pass away for a number of years after that, is anyone's guess. But the letter and correspondence are out there in the public domain if you look for them on Google.
Okay. So he's made a bishop and then decides in the reign of Paul VI to sort of live a different way. He had his reasons. I mean, he probably saw the direction of the Jesuits, maybe wanted to do a different thing. Eventually, he finds himself in a position where he's going to be a cardinal. Now, this is something that I only ever heard from you. I've never heard it from anybody else. Could you please tell us this story and how Malachi Martin became a cardinal and the geopolitical scenario that was at play at that time?
I'd be happy to. First off, the person who told me that Malachi Martin was a cardinal was Malachi himself. I don't know if you are aware who the late Dr. Rama Kumaraswamy was.
I've never heard of him, no.
Okay. He was very prominent in sedevacantist circles. All right. He wrote an infamous but very accurate book that used to be available through Tan Books called The Problems with the New Mass. Anyway, Dr. Kumaraswamy wanted to be ordained a priest, but he was married. All right. However, when he wanted to be ordained a priest, he and his wife were already in their early 70s. So there was not a question of him remaining, physically continent from his wife. She obviously was in complete agreement. Her name was Bernadette. They've both gone to their reward. There was not a problem. And there were two bishops there who were, I were told, independent Catholic bishops. I do not remember their names. I was in a motor vehicle accident while making the movie Hostage to the Devil, and I sustained a traumatic brain injury as well as other injuries. So I apologize if I cannot remember the bishops' names. But I drove Malachi up there on 2 consecutive days, and they had just moved. The Kumaraswamy family had just moved into a very large house in rural Wilton, Connecticut, and there were packing boxes everywhere, and basically we were offered bottled water as a refreshment. And Malachi, in a rare show of being peeved, because I never saw him get angry very much, he said these words to me in my Jeep on the way back on the second day after the ordination to the priesthood. The first day was the ordination to the diaconate. The second day was the ordination to the priesthood. Apparently, it's in the Code of Canon Law that those ordinations cannot take place on the same day. Anyway.
So let me pause you there because I want to clarify. And Joe, maybe you can jump in because there's been some ideas that Malachi was involved in the sedevacantist situation. So was he ordaining sedevacantist priests, or was it more of just sort of an independent priest thing, and then they kind of did their own ideas? How did that work?
That's easily explained. I have no proof that Malachi Martin was a sedevacantist. He told me that he was greatly troubled by some of the actions and ideas that Pope John Paul II had expressed. He said, but I'm not in a position to declare him deposed from the See of Peter. He said, because that can only be done if it is merited at some point in the future by the church. And he says, I am not the competent authority. The reason why he was there with those two bishops was because he was also, and I saw him do this, there's part of the ordination ceremony where they do an imposition of hands on the ordinand. And he did that. And on the way back, like I said, it was the only time I ever saw him a little bit peeved. He said he was on a first name basis with Dr. Kumarswamy. His name was Rama. And he said, Rama pestered me to ensure that a cardinal from the Vatican would be there at his ordination, and he didn't even offer me a cup of coffee.
So Joe is our resident New Yorker here. If there's ever a cause for Malachi's canonization, he's Irish and a New Yorker, which you know a little bit about. I don't think they're allowed to not have tempers. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm 60% Irish, and I live right here in Long Island, New York. I come from basically a Catholic stock, so I the temper dies hard, really. I'm 31 years old and it still hasn't gone away. In fact, it only seems to get worse the worse traffic gets. But and it's not. I'll tell you, it's not getting any better. I don't know if Rob is a New Yorker, but
born in Brooklyn, Bay Ridge.
Are you still in New York?
No, I live in central New Jersey now.
Oh well, geez, frying pan into the fire, eh? But fair enough. I've taken somewhat of an interest lately in what the history of the sedevacantist movement, and I've had some conversations with people regarding this, and one of whom is at the WM Review, runs a good blog. But it's my understanding actually that you may or may not be able to verify whether or not this is true. That the bishops at the ordination there sort of didn't do the formula correctly, and I have heard actually that Malachi Martin said, as a bishop, I could fix where they messed up. Would you be able to confirm that?
Yes, I can. There's an old phrase, I don't know where it comes from, that says "once more into the breach," but that's exactly what Malachi did, because apparently there's a prayer that when that prayer is said, the ordaining bishop must have his hands over the ordinand, and that's when Malachi said that prayer and imposed his hands over Dr. Kumarswamy's head.
Okay, so how does Malachi, we should say it the Irish way, how does Malachi end up being a cardinal of the Catholic Church? How does it get to the point where, I believe it was 1984, around there? Let's explain that situation, how that comes to pass.
Sure. In everyone remembers, because it's kind of infamous now, but everyone remembers back in March 1984, Pope John Paul II had the original Pilgrim Virgin statue of Our Lady of Fatima brought from the shrine to St. Peter's Square for a consecration of the human race in March 1984 to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And because the consecration prayer is online, you can look it up. And as part of that consecration prayer, he said, "We especially consecrate to you those peoples and that nation who are awaiting our consecration." Which clearly means that I'm not really consecrating them right now, God, but you know who I'm talking about. He was going to say Russia, and he was prevailed upon due to the delicacy, apparently, of the international situation. Was the literally part of the military height of the Cold War. He was prevailed upon by his circle of advisors. Don't say Russia, Holiness. But it was in the litany of prayers where he said, from the scourge, and I'm paraphrasing, from the scourge of war, preserve us. From the scourge of nuclear war, preserve us. And what had happened was Vatican intelligence, which is the envy of any intelligence organization in the world, Vatican intelligence had received word that at the time, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was a man named Yuri Andropov. He was the former head of the KGB, the initial standing for, in Russian, the Committee for State Security. And Vatican intelligence was informed that in 1985, before what Russian military theorists and Marxist military theorists refer to as the correlation of forces, that the Russians intended to launch what's known as a short warning military attack against NATO, because it was at the time that President Reagan had approximately 3.5 to 4 years to make good on his promise to revitalize militarily the North Atlantic Alliance. That meant a couple of thousand of the new M1 Abrams tanks to replace the M60A3 Patton tanks, aircraft like the F-16 Fighting Falcon and the F-15 Eagle to replace the F-4 Phantom. The Soviets knew that at the time, that had Reagan's plan come to fruition, that the NATO qualitative edge would more than offset their numerical edge in sheer military terms. I don't know if any of you are young enough to remember, but at the time, I was in college in Washington at the Catholic University, and the Russians had deployed in Eastern Europe and the Western military districts of the old Soviet Union the SS-20 intermediate range nuclear missile. And the Soviets ginned up a huge propaganda effort to get the West, and specifically the United States, not to install as a countervailing measure on NATO's part the Pershing II nuclear missile. There were huge protests across Western Europe at the time, led by Soviet front groups, leading crowds of what we used to call in the agency the useful This is a long-winded way of saying that the Soviets had planned to punch a hole in NATO's defenses in Western Europe, and they were going to use tactical nuclear weapons on the SS-20 missiles to do so. And they had units, in addition to things like the Guards tank armies, Guards units being an honorific leftover from World War II, to punch through these irradiated fire breaks that they created in Western NATO's defenses at both the Fulda Gap and the northern reaches of the inner German border. The plan, I don't remember the Russian name, but in English it translates to 7 days to the Rhine, meaning the Rhine River. They were going to stop at the French border because they were not about to invade a country that had its own independent nuclear force, not under the control of the Pentagon. This word got to the Vatican. Pope John Paul II took it very, very seriously, which is why he had the Pilgrim Virgin statue brought to Rome, and there are photos of him kneeling in St. Peter's Square before Our Lady of Fatima's statue, with the crowds behind barriers in the background. He said the prayer in March of 1984, and on May 13th of 1984, in the Soviet city of Severomorsk, which is way up around the top of the North Sea, around the Kola Peninsula, I believe. I don't have a map in front of me. Near Murmansk, which was the base, the headquarters of the Soviet Northern Red Banner Fleet, charged with interdicting NATO reinforcement convoys across Europe. It was one of the infamously closed cities of the old Soviet Union. There were massive explosions at the conserved ammunition storage depots for the Soviet Northern Fleet on May 13th, 1984. The explosions were so strong that there are pictures, not many, but there are pictures online you can find. It actually looks like a nuclear bomb went off with the mushroom cloud. The explosions were of such an intensity that they were registered on seismic equipment in Sweden and England at the time. And they basically knocked out the warfighting capability of the Soviet Northern Red Banner Fleet for approximately 2 years, because they destroyed all of the cruise missiles and anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles that the fleet had, with the exception of what was already on board the ships. The ships would not be able to replenish once firing off their initial combat, what's called loadout. The same day, at a city called Schwerin, Schwerin, East Germany, there was a huge explosion at an ammunition depot for one of the Red Army's premier tank armies in the Group Soviet Forces Germany, the GSFG. Apparently it blew out, the explosion was of such force it blew out windows in like a 5-kilometer radius of the storage base. And not to be outdone, either that day or 1 or 2 days later, at a Soviet strategic bomber base inside the Soviet Union, at an air regiment, because they called at the time, the Red Air Force referred to their bomber units as not wings but regiments, had a either a backfire or Badger regiment. There were also explosions that destroyed their stockpiles of what were called, I believe, the AS-16 Kelt, NATO code name KELT. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone in the chat can correct me on that. But taken together, what it did was it took the option of a viable start to a Soviet Warsaw Pact offensive against the West off the table for approximately 2 years. Well, the Vatican didn't know that this was going to happen. All right, but Pope John Paul II had the intelligence that the Soviets were planning something. But you know that in the world of politics, international politics, you don't have only military preparations, but you also have diplomatic preparations. And apparently this Council of 12 Cardinals no longer exists now because the Soviet Marxist-Leninist Party state / empire is now gone. But there was apparently formed a council of 12 administrative cardinals in various parts of the world that if war broke out in Europe and the Soviets hit Rome, because Italy was a member of the NATO alliance, if they hit Rome with a thermonuclear warhead and the Pope died as a result, then the administrators, the cardinal administrators in various parts of the world would function as the de facto leadership of the church until a conclave could be called and a new supreme pontiff elected. And Malachi was the de facto cardinal for the United States and Canada. But that was only something that would be exercised in Latin, I believe. The phrase is in extremis. You're not going to find, you're not going to find it on Google. Right? and I doubt, I doubt that anyone would be able to produce documents to that effect, because Malachi was, let me put it this way, he was three things to me. First and foremost, he was my spiritual director and confessor. He was also my best friend, and he was also my confessor. And he knew he could trust me. So that's what I found these things out.
So basically, Malachi and others were made cardinals. Do you know who any of the other ones were, or is that sort of you don't?
No, that was held to be in strict confidence, and I would never know who those other individuals were.
Well, it's funny, and then I want to get your opinion here, Joe, in a sec, but I'm friends with Father Charles Murr, and he was close with Cardinal Gagnon and Mario Marini and these various big players in the Vatican. And he was in his late 20s, had just been ordained when he kind of got in with this crowd. These guys were all, grown men, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, had been in the priesthood in the Vatican for a while. And he had all these stories that he knew he could tell when they died, because people need to hear them, but he waited till they died, so he was in confidence for sure. But there came a point when, he could tell you where the bodies were buried. Joe, have you ever heard this story that Malachi Martin was a cardinal, and your musings and stuff on the internet about Malachi?
Like, research Malachi Martin a bit. I like Malachi Martin a whole lot. I mean, I've listened to his the Jansen interviews, for instance, mostly, and I haven't come across this just yet. I've heard a lot about Fatima, and his takes on the crisis in the church, and his thoughts on Lefebvre and the Black Mass that occurred, but nothing like him being a cardinal. I guess I'm still a little unclear on it in a way. So was he? Did he hold the office of cardinal, or was he only going to be a cardinal should X, Y, and Z happen?
He was a cardinal, all right, but he did not administratively exercise the the office in the traditional way that we think of it. However, when I found that out, and I didn't press him on this, but it cleared up a number of things for me. For example, we all know that at the time Cardinal Bernardin in Chicago was a notorious heretic, among other things. And it had always puzzled me why someone like Cardinal Bernardin didn't squash Malachi Martin like a bug. Because given his contacts within the church, he certainly could have done so. But then when I found out what the truth was, then all of a sudden a little light bulb went on over my head. And I thought to myself, okay, well, now I know. And by the way, back in 1995, I went to Italy on vacation. And a month before I went to Italy, I met Malachi for lunch at a little Greasy Spoon Deli in Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. We'd like to go to between 61st and 62nd Street. I think it's called the Stage Deli. But I told him, I said, I'm going to Italy. A friend of mine has done a pen and ink rendition of the image of Our Lady of Fatima that you can just barely see over my shoulder. I would love to present that to the Holy Father. And he said, meet me back here for lunch tomorrow. I'll see what I can do. And he placed a call to the Vatican. And several weeks later, I was handing that pen and ink rendition of Our Lady, it was about 20 by 24, to Pope John Paul II immediately prior to his Wednesday audience in the Nervi Hall. It was not in the Nervi Hall per se, it was like in a private antechamber where there were maybe 15, 20 people there. I was there with a friend of mine who traveled with me from the United States. And so, you know the phrase when they say, does someone have juice? Okay. Did he have access? Okay. He made one call, and 3 weeks later, I was looking into Pope John Paul II's face. And there was something, I'll never forget. I handed him, and it was very quick because he looked at the picture and then he smiled, and the Monsignore who was accompanying him took the picture from me and handed me papal rosaries, white papal rosaries. And the Pope obviously had a huge smile on his face, but it proved to me that Father Malachi, had the access within the Vatican to get someone in to see the Holy Father. There's no other way it would have happened.
So that's amazing. Now, we've got so many questions in the chat because there's a million things we could say about Malachi, So one of the ones that people keep asking me, goodness gracious, is there's a question here about Malachi must have known that Bernardin was involved in the ritual in South Carolina that took place. This is to do with the satanic and the enthronement and so forth. Joe and I touched on that a little bit in our show. We did it, but we don't know enough to go into detail. Could you give us some background on that event in the United States?
Yes, the event in the United States took place in South Carolina at a church. They knew that for what they were planning, they could not hold it in the Pauline Chapel within the bounds of Vatican City State. So they had an open telephone line, and he was a priest at the time, and his character's name in Windswept House is the Cardinal of Century City, Cardinal Leonardine. I mean, he didn't go to great lengths to hide the link between that and Bernardine. but the nastier parts of the ritual were held in South Carolina.
Okay. And Joe, I know you had a pen and paper there. Did you have any questions that you wanted to ask?
I did, yeah. One of them was it's funny. Well, not funny, really. You said, well, Martin's stature and Martin's position as a cardinal in the Catholic Church is, in a way, what prevented him from what you said, like being squashed like a bug by Cardinal Bernardin. And the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago is basically, almost a de facto like cardinal of the country, really, because that's one of the, it's one of the most important archdioceses in the whole country. Well, what I was going to ask is the circumstances surrounding Martin's death seem a bit odd when you look into them, and in a way, I was wondering if perhaps Bernardin didn't.
I can clear that up. A couple of days before Malachi Martin died, well, not died, but fell in his apartment, there was nothing nefarious about it. Malachi and I, our birthdays were separated in July by only a few days. And instead of exchanging gifts, what we would do is we would just go out for a nice Italian meal at the I Love Capri restaurant over on 3rd Avenue. And he had called me that morning and in a very strained voice said, Rob, apparently Old Scratch was not pleased with what we were up to in Connecticut last week. He was called to consult on an exorcism because Dr. Kumaraswamy was a psychiatrist as well as, at that point, an ordained priest. He was called to consult on an exorcism, a potential exorcism case. And he was standing on a small, stool in his tiny little, a little rabbit warren of an apartment within Lovanos's apartment complex. And he says, he told me he was kicked out from under him and that he struck his head on his desk. It was a big oak desk. But he struck his head on his desk and he was apologetic. And he said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to make our dinner tonight. And he said, I've got to go now. And then the phone line clicked off. And it wasn't like he was being rushed off the phone. He just very matter-of-factly said in a weak voice, he says, I've got to go now. And those were the last words I ever spoke with him. But the event that led to his death, and what's one of the first things he does? Calls me up to apologize. He can't make dinner.
And that was 98, 99, around there?
July 1999.
Wow. Okay, so do you have any questions?
There's nothing nefarious from a human agency perspective. Because a lot of people say he was pushed down a flight of stairs, he was rubbed out, he was murdered. I can put those things to rest to the point that I'm probably one of the last people around to know the straight facts. And it was as a result of a consultation on a pending exorcism.
You have a question, Mark?
Well, I was just going to say, do we know who it was who maybe started those rumors as to, a nefarious end to his death? Do you have any idea, or was that just a natural cause?
I think that was in the early days of the internet, and if you think the internet, for as politically correct and woke as it is today, it still isn't the Wild West. Go back 25 years, and it was insane. So, he was accused of being an agent of the Mossad.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. But just, he spoke Hebrew, right? I think he was well versed.
He was a polyglot. He spoke several languages.
Yeah.
He
And that,
he was one of the people who originally worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
yeah, this is the thing about Malachi Martin that I find so fascinating. If you didn't have people to corroborate the stories that know him, and you didn't have these interviews with Bernard Jensen and so forth, it'd be like he's made in a lab. He's amazing at languages. He's actually, I mean, just from a strictly academic level, he was an incredible mind. He's got this being imprisoned in the Soviet Union as a secret bishop and a secret cardinal and all these things. And it's actually astonishing. But, when you actually put the pieces together, it turns out that it's all, I mean, there's too many people who are too trustworthy, and his intellect was too sharp and his stories were too consistent for these silly rumors to keep being taken seriously by people, in my opinion. That's just how I see it.
Well, a couple of things that I want to show you, good folks. I hope you can see it well enough and that there's no glare. Do you see that picture?
Yes, we see that. Yeah.
Okay.
That's you and him.
That's a very young me with Father Martin in the Lavanos apartment. And those are Mrs. Lavanos's works of art. She did a very unique kind of religious iconography at the school, the Isabel O'Neill School to Painted Finish. And that was one of those fortunate times when, he didn't stand on ceremony when he went out to grab a bite to eat. Or sometimes I would just bring submarine sandwiches up there, and we'd have lunch in their little kitchen. That's just he was very informal that way. He would sometimes hear my confession when we were just walking around the streets of the city on the Upper East Side, and a lot of people knew him very casually as Dr. Martin. I mean, cabbies would slow down in the street, and I'd hear them yell out, "Yo, Dr. Martin!" And he'd turn around and he'd say, "Freddie, how are you? How's Bernadette and the kids?" He was very, very well known because he had been in that part of New York by that point for over 20 years.
Joe, you got something to ask, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm having very much a nostalgia trip just thinking of the Upper East Side of Manhattan. But I mean, I could go back there whenever I want, but it's changed a bit. This is actually kind of, I don't know, kind of a dumb question in some ways, but has he ever said anything about the correlation between him? There seems to be a link between him and the character of Father Merrin from the Exorcist movie. I don't know if that's completely by accident, but has he ever mentioned anything like that? Because Father Merrin
never mentioned anything about the movie The Exorcist to me, with the exception of the fact that, to his knowledge, in all the exorcisms he'd ever consulted on or performed, no one's head ever spun 360 degrees. He never said anything about being identifiable or co-identified with Max von Sydow's character, Father Merrin. But he said that a lot of the effect of that movie was as a pure horror movie in what he called the vein of Frankenstein and Dracula. He would have classified an exorcism like that, though, as a very dirty exorcism. He said there were some that were very dirty, and not dirty as in pornographic, but dirty as in just
messy.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there were some that he referred to as hammer and tongs, in which it was just a constant back and forth spiritual battle where any paranormal manifestations of on the physical plane were held to a minimum, but it made them no less intense on the exorcism.
Now, here's a question I have. Malachi Martin was a fan of, friendly with the Society of St. Pius X. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, he was. Back in the early 1990s, after I met Father Malachi, I was assigned by the agency to an assignment out at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I can spell Albuquerque. I defy any of you to spell Albuquerque right on the first shot. I just got it wrong so many times. But I asked him, I said, where will I be able to attend the traditional Mass? And he said, to his knowledge, because of whoever the Archbishop was out there at the time was a rather notorious modernist. He said the only place you're going to be able to get it in Albuquerque will be at a chapel of what is called the Society of St. Pius X. And he said, he says, if you tell anyone you've gone to their masses, they will say that they're in schism. They're not in schism. Their mass is perfectly valid. You're going to receive the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our blessed Lord, and you will receive it validly, and you are not committing a schismatic act. He said, and I said, and that piqued my interest because at that point I had never heard of the SSPX. And he said, well, if you want to educate yourself, he said, go to Angelus Press and look up the writings of a gentleman named Michael Davies. And that's when I educated myself, and I bought his trilogy, the mammoth magnum opus of his on the Protestant Revolution in the Catholic Church, and as well as his Apologia pro Marcel Lefebvre. And he told me, he said, one day when sanity has returned to the church, that Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre will be canonized as saint.
Hear, hear.
I believe that.
I believe that too. So, someone in the chat here, they're asking about Chiesa Viva. I've heard of them before. They said they did a great job on him. Did Father Martin know Father Villa, who did Chiesa Viva?
He may have known him. I don't know. I only know of the priest that Father Martin spoke to me of. He was very good friends with the late Father Charles Fiore. He was friends with Father Alfred Kunz, the priest who was murdered, I believe, out in Wisconsin. He was friends with Father Brian Harrison. In fact, the two of them on the day or the day after the Luciferian enthronement was supposed to be attempted at the dual chapels in Rome and South Carolina. Malachi in his little apartment in New York and Father Harrison at a chapel in the Vatican said masses of reparation for that blasphemous act.
Yeah, Joe and I talked about that. There was an article in the Remnant that was quite instructive on that. Question here. Person says, I have heard Father Martin saying that Satan and Lucifer are two different entities. I've always wondered why. Do you have any insight into that?
I don't know why, but I do remember Malachi telling me that Lucifer was the fallen archangel who was kind of like head of the whole show, and Satan was one of his chief underlings and chief accuser of souls before God. Right. But anything further than that, I can't elaborate on, and I'm not going to pretend to.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I've heard similar things too, listening to talks by Father Ripperger and other exorcists, that they're separate entities technically, but we say demonic, satanic, Luciferian kind of interchangeably, just sort of gets in common.
I don't want to interact with either of them.
yeah, exactly. Mem Legu in the chat asks, he said he had interaction with Malachi, who tried to stop him from going to Eastern Orthodoxy because he said there were more Masonic bishops in Orthodoxy than in the Catholic Church. Is that anything you've ever spoken about with him?
No, what Malachi told me though was that Freemasonry and the high levels of Freemasonry, as opposed to like the Shriners who drive the funny little cars around Philadelphia, raising money for their hospitals. But he said the higher levels of Freemasonry, uh, starting back around or before the time of their infamous document called the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, he said that they had begun their efforts at a systemic and global penetration of the Roman Catholic Church. And he said that continues down to the present day. In fact, one of the more infamous people involved in Freemasonry was the late Archbishop Annibale Bugnini.
Yes.
And Malachi said that they brought irrefutable evidence of Archbishop Bugnini's Masonic membership to Pope Paul VI. And the next day, he was on a one-way ticket Alitalia flight to Tehran, Iran, as the apostolic nuncio to all 6 Catholics in the capital of Tehran.
All 6 of them. Yeah.
So, but he was quite clear about that.
I had a question about what Martin's perspective on Pope John the 23rd might have been. So obviously you have the ordeal with him and the Third Secret, and John the 23rd, revealing, according to Martin, which seems accurate, that the Third Secret is not for our time, right? Which is what John the 23rd said in 1960. John the 23rd otherwise seems like, you ask certain sedevacantist that maybe he's a Freemason or something like that. But John the 23rd, by all appearances, is Orthodox. Had Martin spoken on John the 23rd as a man or potentially as a Freemason or anything of this sort to you?
He never told me he was a Freemason. He never made any inference to that fact. What he told me, though, was that Pope John the 23rd was very naive and very easily manipulated by the more cunning cardinals and archbishops surrounding him. And he did kick off the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council with very, very, what we would call Orthodox Roman Catholic intent. He said, however, he realized just before his death that the council had been hijacked by the Northern European contingent, which were bent on imposing a much more progressive, liberal, and insidious vision upon the church than John the 23rd had ever in his wildest dreams thought the council would do. And what he told me was, his statement was, John the 23rd died in his regrets.
Yeah, I've actually, if you read Father Murr's, I don't know which number, one of his books before his recent Freemasonry book, he talks about his interaction with Madre Pascalina, who was Pius XII's personal secretary, and she was there right after he passed away, and John the 23rd came in, and for all intents and purposes, he was Orthodox, but he just wasn't a strong enough figure for the time, essentially, as a man. It wasn't about his beliefs or his orthodoxy, it was just his personality, basically.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
One person's in the chat asking, what did Malachi Martin think about Medjugorje? You can say it. You can say it. I'm not saying it.
Okay. No, I'm happy to say it. Malachi told me that he thought that perhaps the first 2 or 3 of the alleged apparitions may have been legitimate, but that after that, that the seers had succumbed to what I laughingly refer to as an old Sinatra song called "The Good Life." All right, and they liked the notoriety, they liked the attention, and there was a priest who, I don't remember his name. It's one of those weird Slavic names that just escapes me at the moment, Drago or something, but that he was directly disobedient to the bishop there with regard to the alleged apparitions. And that's when Malachi said that if it was a true apparition, the seers would be obedient to the bishop instead of defiant. And he said that in his mind, with the exception of perhaps the first couple of alleged apparitions, the whole thing, in his words, his direct words, was a satanic fraud.
Wow. What do you think, Joe? You're muted yourself, Joe, I think. It's not
You
coming.
lost your voice, Joe?
Maybe just unplug your headphones. Can't hear you.
Throw some holy water on your screen.
I told you. I told you. Here, leave and come back. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Oh, this is one I want to get from you. This is what I want. We talked about this on the phone, Rob. This is a break the internet kind of thing. An Art Bell caller asked about the Antichrist having already been born, and Malachi cut him off and said, "No, I said alive, not born. Alive, yes, but born is something else." So you've told me before about Malachi said that the Antichrist might actually have been born, and that's a whole other thing. So why don't you just give us the lowdown on that?
Okay. This topic came up when we were on the Lexington Avenue subway line going down to a religious goods store. And I was asking him about it. And he said that I recall him saying that the Antichrist came into existence in approximately the year 1962, born in the Middle East, and that he would reveal himself most likely towards the middle to end of the 21st century. And I was kind of incredulous about that, and I said, how's that possible, Mal? Because if that's the case, he's going to be in whatever they're using for a wheelchair in the year 2060. And he said, no. He says, you're overlooking something. Because his father is Lucifer, he will appear ageless. He will hit approximately the physical appearance of the age of about 35, and then his aging progression will stop.
Just to go down a rabbit hole here about how that's possible, just for the sake of conversation, and then Joe, you can ask your question that you got muted from. There's a lot of the great saints and theologians say that the Antichrist will actually resemble Christ, look like him, like in an actual almost doppelganger kind of way. And Christ died at the age of 33, of course. And the book Lord of the World by Hugh Benson, in that book, there's this theme back and forth where the last remaining, spoiler alert, but he's one of the last remaining priests on earth after a Freemasonic takeover and, genocide and all this kind of stuff. The Antichrist comes along, and there's this reference where they keep saying, well, they look so much alike. They look so much alike. Basically, the last pope, who's sort of the savior, who's the last remaining, holy Catholic, looks like the Antichrist. They sort of play on that theme. He wasn't writing a strictly theological work. It was more of just teasing out some ideas from the early kind of 1900s. But also, one thing that's strong in the church fathers about the Nephilim is that there is some way, I don't understand it, I don't know, but there is some way that essentially that the fallen angels are able to procreate somehow with the human race. And I just wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if that's where a possibility like that would happen. That's just totally out in left field, but that reminds me of the things that the church fathers have said about the ability for fallen angels to procreate and create the Nephilim. So I guess something like this could be found in tradition. Yeah. Okay, Joe, you had a question.
How am I now? Am I audible?
You're good. Yeah, you sound good.
All right. Yeah, I got a call during the during that, so I think that that's what happened. But anyway, yeah, actually, I mean, on to Malachi Martin's thoughts on things. I was specifically, I mean, I know when he wrote The Keys of This Blood, he was in a kind of writing from a more pro John Paul II standpoint. I was wondering more what his opinion of John Paul II was when he passed away. And, you know, in his time in New York, if there was any, I don't know if the two would have been there at the same time, but if there was Gene at all.
If there was, it would have been very discreet, very, very discreet. I do know that John Paul II started out with Malachi as being a pope of great promise, but ultimately ended up disappointing him. And when I asked why, he said because of his philosophical background of what he termed a phenomenologist versus someone who is a Thomistic scholar and follower of St. Thomas Aquinas. And me being dumb as a brick on some of this stuff, I said, what's the difference between phenomenology and Thomism? And in his very pithy way, he explained it to me this way. Malachi said, imagine that you walk into your house and you just had a new white rug installed in your living room. And your little doggy has made a doo-doo mess in the middle of the rug. He said, a phenomenologist will look at it, ponder it, and say, I see what appears to be dog doo-doo in the middle of the rug. I do sincerely wonder what that means. And he said, whereas a Thomist would open the door, see the doo-doo on the rug, and go, honey, the dog went to the bathroom on the rug again.
Yeah.
And he said it was because of his background as a phenomenologist that led him to always want to keep an open mind regarding things that other people would have seen as blatantly heretical, such as the prayer gathering in Assisi.
That's a really good observation. In the last however many years in the church, like you look at men like Ratzinger and John Paul II, they've got big brains. They're super smart. I think Bishop Williams had said incredible hardware, but not the right software. Like these men, obviously, John Paul II knew a ton of languages. I mean, he was up there with the big brains in the church, but it was like paralysis of analysis, paralysis by analysis. We know the problems in the church. Let's have another synod. Let's have another whatever. And we'll try to figure out how we can understand those in a way that et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, no, if it doesn't jive with your Baltimore Catechism or your Pius X Catechism, it's probably just not Catholic. You should probably just move on.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you something. Going back to your question about Medjugorje before, all right. I remember Malachi told me one way to drive partisans of Medjugorje screaming up a wall. He said, look at them and say, in all likelihood, Garabandal was a very valid apparition. Medjugorje is false. He said, and then just sit back and watch the fireworks.
It's funny. Maybe Joe, you more. I have never waded into Garabandal or Medjugorje. Like I just haven't. I reverted to the faith roughly 8 years ago, and I've just been trying to learn all the essentials the whole time. I haven't really gone into it. But Joe, do you have opinion on Garabandal? I've heard mixed things on it. I don't really know enough about it.
I don't have an opinion per se. I remember listening to some videos about it from the Fatima Center, but and not being particularly convinced one way or the other. More with Garabandal and unapproved apparitions, I was always sort of detached in the sense that I was like, well, I don't really need these because I have Akita and La Salette and Buen Suceso. I was going to kind of segue to another question kind of off that. Martin having known the third secret, did he indicate that any of the other apparitions were kind of the telling of the third secret by other means? I'm thinking specifically of Akita.
You don't follow Garabandal very much, but he indicated that Garabandal let part of the cat out of the bag, but that more of the cat was let out of the bag by the apparitions in Akita to Sister Agnes Sasagawa, as well as, interestingly enough, Pope John Paul II himself in his 1981 visit to Fulda, Germany. Because, and he did it in an almost passive-aggressive way when someone asked him, why hasn't the third secret been released? And he said that his predecessors in the Petrine office declined to reveal it so as not to give the worldwide power of communism the ability to make certain military moves against the West that the West would be almost powerless against. And then he went on to say, it should suffice to say this much. If there does exist a message in which it is said that there will be great earthquakes and great tidal waves, and that entire nations and millions of people will be wiped off the earth from one moment to the next, if you're only interested in the content of that message for sensationalism's purposes, is there any real point in wanting to publish it in the first place? Think about that. Because he basically said, to my mind, what's in part of the message. And, whenever Malachi would say, parts of the third secret are far, far worse than that. He never told me what he meant by that. All right. Except to allude to the fact that when John the 23rd read the secret and put it back and declined to publish it and said, this does not pertain to our pontificate. And this is speculation, okay, that it was referring to a future pope or claimant to the Petrine office who would be under the de facto, if not de jure, influence or control of global Freemasonry.
That makes sense.
And the only thing I'm going to say is, Pachamama. Anyway.
All right. So me and my friend Mark here, he's not my brother. People have been asking. We're just both really handsome. But he's got 10 kids. I've got 5 kids. We've got 15 rambunctious, screaming children in the house, and our wives are doing amazing jobs entertaining them and so forth. But we just wanted to make sure we didn't miss this. We're going to have to call it a night here, gentlemen. We'll have you on again at some point, Rob, because there's so much more. And in fact, people in the chat, people want to know things, people watching this after the fact, click in the description to the show, and you will find the contact us for the website, the Candidate Report website. You can join the email list and you can email us questions. And if you email questions about Malachi Martin, what we'll do is we'll actually kind of put some together, and then we'll have Rob back on the show, a month or two, whatever. And we'll if he's available, and we'll do something else and talk about it. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we signed off here, Rob?
Yes, real quickly.
Sure.
This corporal cloth that I'm holding in my hand is a corporal cloth that Father Martin said Mass on each day.
Okay.
One of several he had. I consider it to be one of my most precious possessions. That plus, he gave me 1 year as a Christmas gift an inlaid solid silver icon crucifix. On one side, you can see is our Lord, surrounded by various saints. On the other side, it's Our Lady holding the Christ child, and she's also surrounded by depictions of the evangelists in their biblical symbiology as a man, a lion, an eagle, whatever. Those are some of my most precious possessions. So
wonderful. All right, well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Any last words, Joe? Not like you're going to die or something, but last words for the show.
No, I appreciate you coming on, Rob. This was fascinating to me as a admirer of Malachi Martin.
Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, like the video, subscribe to the channel. You know the deal. Help get the lights on. Don't be afraid to become a patron. Click links in the description for books and all that sort of stuff. Click the notification bell. Click the thumbs up. I keep saying like the like button, but really it's a thumbs up button, but it means like. So if you need visuals, it's the one that looks like that. Okay,
And
it's not the
leave a comment.
Yes, leave a comment. Yeah. Even especially if you want to tell us if you like Joe's haircut or not, or Mark's, because they're both pretty similar there.
We have the same barber.
Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.